Good morning. Thank you. My name is Anne Marie Weissman. I'm the director of the Policy Development Group, a position I've held for a very long time. It's been 10 days now. I've been in the office for one of those days. Happy to be here with you for several of those days. This position is very much similar to the last position I had, which focused mostly on loan issues, and now I'm focusing mostly on general provisions. So I didn't even have to move offices, which is great because I hate to pack. A few things about me, just so you know my background. Again, I was the director of the Policy Coordination Group for about 4.5 years. Prior to that, that's within Office of Post-Secondary Education. Prior to that, I was in federal student aid, working as a training manager, a training officer, and in program compliance, where I got to do program reviews and institutional eligibility and all of the fun stuff that you love us to come do with your institutions. Now people like to see me a little more than they like to do when I first started, so this is great. I have several other sessions that I'm doing at the conference, so I hope to see you at other sessions that I'm doing. I have borrower defense later today and the open forum. And then tomorrow I have the last 2 sessions of the conference. So that is always fun to close it out. I got to do the first session as an intro session, and I get to do the last. So tomorrow morning, first thing in the morning is borrower defense, and then professional judgment. I would love to see you there as well. If you have questions after the session, we will leave some time at the end. We have 4 microphones stationed in the aisles, and we will make sure that everybody can hear your questions. Since the sessions are being recorded, and we will choose which ones go on, if you do not wish your question to be heard by all of your colleagues, you can feel free to come see me afterwards, or if you prefer, you can email me. Our format for emails at the department is always firstname.lastname@ed.gov. So the spelling of my name is on the slides. You can feel free to email me as well. I am also asked to remind you that there are conference evaluations that are available on the mobile app, as well as a link will be emailed to everybody who registered in advance for the conference. We would like you to provide feedback on how we're doing. Also, you can evaluate each session, and I would certainly appreciate it if you would evaluate this one. As I always say, like your Uber driver, I would love your 5-star rating. However, if you do not feel the session warrants a 5-star rating, I would love your feedback about that as well. We are not presenting this one again today, but still we have information to give out to other constituents. So in case I happen to reuse the presentation, feel free to let me know if there's things that should be added, subtracted, or said differently. Again, questions and answers at the end. We will give you kind of a deeper dive into accreditation in 3 webinars that I will be presenting in January. So look for more information about that as well. And I think that concludes our announcements. In the presentation, I do use some abbreviations, and I don't like to presume that everybody knows the abbreviations that I use. So I will give you kind of the quick overview here. Probably the one that surprises most people is that we are ED, not DOE. That is the Department of Energy. Most of these, though, I do think are familiar to you, but again, we have new people, and I want to make sure everybody speaks the same language. I also want to do a quick commercial for our negotiated rulemaking website. The documents that we use throughout the process are located on this website. There is a very long link that you can use to get there, but I prefer to just direct people to the ed.gov website and have you type in the search box rulemaking, and then this one is the 2018-19 rulemaking session. So all of the documents, again, that you need should be on that site. The list of negotiators, the Federal Register notice links, and other documents that we use throughout. Other places you might want to go for some additional information would be the regulations.Gov website. That has all of the public comments that were submitted and posted. So we eliminate duplicates, but then everything else is on there. So the docket ID number is what you would submit to go quickly to this regulatory effort. Also, the Federal Register has the official copies of all of our regulations, and you can do various search and filter options to get to that Federal Register. It's generally easier, I find, to go and search initially by the Department of Education, and then you can kind of filter down by date, and it's usually easy to locate that way. So this negotiated rulemaking is something that we had considered for a long time. We looked at what topics we wanted to cover, and we kind of ended up with a bit of a regulatory potpourri, for lack of a better word. We had a main committee that covered accreditation as well as any subcommittee topics. For the first time ever, we had 3 subcommittees, and I will admit that was a bit of a challenge to have them going on concurrently. It was a lot to absorb. The subcommittees, though, brought their recommendations back to the full committee, and only the members of the full committee were able to vote. The subcommittees were there to kind of work out some of the details and then bring that back to the others on the committee. So the subcommittee members were typically unique and not repeating members of the full committee, although we did have some overlap, which helped to provide for some additional consistency. There are also presentations here at the conference from other members of the staff that have worked on this package related to distance ed, Teach Grant, and the faith-based initiatives. Those sessions are number 13 and 14, so please take a look at those if you'd like additional information. While those topics are covered in this package, I am not addressing those just because, again, we have other full sessions related to those topics, but I did want to let you know where you could find that information. So on to the process. NEGREG is, for me, a really interesting process. I've been a negotiator a couple of times now and also at the table for another effort. And I find that it's a really great place for us to get feedback about what you're thinking on a very intense level to some extent. We hear public comments before we ever get to the NEGREG table. We do public hearings. And this time we had 3 of them. We always hold one in DC since we're there. It's easier for a lot of people to get to. And then we typically do others around the country. And we did those back in September of 2018. So that's why we often refer to it as the 2018-19 regulatory effort. It really starts before we hit the table. So we had, as I mentioned, the constituencies represented on the main committee. There are many of them, and so I've listed them here for you. It's typically members of institutions of higher education in all of the different sectors. We also have other parties that we feel are appropriate for that regulatory effort. So you'll see here that because we touched faith-based issues, we then had a faith-based higher education official at the table as well as a backup. We always have financial aid administrators as one of our representatives, as one of our constituencies. Although we have representatives from the other institution types, that one is to focus primarily on financial aid administrators. Keep in mind all of these constituencies that you see represented and those on the next page, we are expecting those negotiators to go out and solicit feedback from their constituents. So they are to go out before sessions, in between sessions, and sometimes after sessions, and get your feedback about what they'd like to see, how they'd like things to proceed. So sometimes that's done through professional associations, sometimes it's done through things like email from the negotiator to other members of that constituency, other listservs. There are various ways that people can get your feedback. But I would encourage you in the future, as we have negotiated rulemaking, if you've not been part of this process, to consider being a negotiator or being a backup, or at least giving feedback to the person that is the negotiator for your constituent. These, again, are the kind of additional list. Because we were dealing with accreditation issues, we had members from accrediting agencies on the committee, which we often do. We also want to make sure we always have students on the committees. Students struggle sometimes to get to the sessions because they are very long, they're intense, they're several days in a row, and we don't want to take them away from their studies. But we do think it's really, really important to have the students on the committees because many of our regulations affect them heavily. This time, a constituency that we typically did not have in the past was employers. And I thought that was a really important thing that we had this time because we were looking at how accrediting agencies work and how sometimes outside constituencies affect that accreditation, how the employers interact with, especially in certificate programs, but in other programs as well. So they have a set interest in how those programs are being run. They would like to be involved in helping you establish them in some cases. So we wanted to get them in on this part of the process as well. We had somebody representing veterans, someone from the legal aid community, and also one that we had initially not gone out with in our proposal to regulate, but we added once we got to the table, was the state higher ed executive officers. And so that was something that we go out with the list of constituencies that we think we need to represent, and we solicit negotiators. And we got those back, and we processed those, and we had everybody come to the table, and then somebody said, you know, we feel that this group wasn't represented, and we'd like to have a representative on the committee. So that has to be done by consensus of the entire committee, and we ended up voting on that and agreeing to that. He did not have a backup, since that was done at kind of the last minute, but every other constituency had at least one representative and then one backup. So the rulemaking itself occurred over the course of the mid-January to the first week in April. When we first went out with the dates for NEGREG, we said it would be January, February, and March. We unfortunately had some bad weather in the district, which means we had 3 snowflakes. I'm not originally from DC, though I do live there now. But snow is not a good thing, and freezing rain and things like that are not a good thing in the district. It seems to grind us to a halt. So we had some cancellation. We had 1 cancellation and 1 delay. That really set us back because we had a lot of topics to cover. What we heard from the negotiators during the March session was we needed to have extended hours. We typically do 9 to 5. Sometimes 9 to 4, and they said, how about we do 8 to 6 and we work through lunch? So my thinking was, yes, I get to talk more. No, it's really all of us talking. I get to talk a little, but it was important. It was important to the negotiators to have more time to try to make up for what we lost. As we were getting toward the end of that week, we found that we still had a lot to talk about, and we were not getting near the point where we could end up discussing how we might want to vote on these issues and whether people could agree to language or not. We worked really hard. We did extended hours, and we still weren't there. For the first time that I'm aware of, the negotiators asked for more time, and we said yes. A lot of times people have asked, and we've said, sorry, no, we can't. The no, we can't is usually for very good reasons. It's often we don't have space, or we don't have staffing that we need for parts of the effort, or we're going to run out of time if we want to meet the master calendar, which is important, but to me it was not an important enough reason to say no at this time. We had so many topics, we had so much to discuss, and I just thought it was really important. And so when I proposed the idea to those who could make that decision, they said to me, can you do that? And I said, well, yeah, of course I can. Like, it's more a matter of, can we do it? And I think the important thing there was they were recognizing that the days were long and that a lot of people were getting tired. But my feeling was, if the negotiators are coming to me saying, I want more time, I'm not going to be the one to say no. We need more. We need more time to talk about this. And I think that adding that extra time was really, it was a great effort on the part of all of the negotiations and the negotiators. So for you who all fit into some constituency here, please thank those who negotiated on your behalf, because they worked really, really hard and went well above what we ever could have asked of them. If you look at these dates, the last 2 weeks were back-to-back weeks, and some people had to travel quite a distance to get there. So it was a supreme effort on their part, and I do feel that that's what got us to consensus. Also, for the first time, in at least a long time, we had everything broken out from the package into 3 buckets. So we grouped the topics into buckets, and we did that not to confuse people, but to get to the point where we hoped we could at least get consensus on something. Usually we say you have to have consensus on all of the issues in the whole package to be able to say that consensus was met. Consensus was something that we were really working toward, and it was really important to us at the department. So our feeling was, if we could break it up into groups, then we could say we had consensus on the grouping, and that would at least be some consensus. Deep down, there were a couple of us that thought maybe it was possible to get consensus on all of it. If you heard Diane's speech yesterday, Diane Jones talked about the idea of thinking maybe she was the only one who had hope that we could get consensus on all of it. I was the second one then. I had really hoped. I wasn't sure it would work, but it did, and we're very proud of that. So I have here the dates for the rulemaking just to give you a little bit of context. We published the NPRM, which is the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, with the proposed rules that contained the consensus language back in June. And then we had a 30-day comment period where we open it up to public comments. We then read and review every public comment that's received. This time we got many fewer than we usually get. We only had about 200 comments, 205, 206 and through there. But we do read every one, and usually there are multiple people at the department who read every one. They are very important to us. That tells us if we got it right or not. A lot of times we don't get consensus, and so that's a big opportunity to say, here's what you should do instead of what you've proposed. But here it's still important because we need to know if we got it right. If there's something that we missed at the table, when you're negotiating, there's a lot of things coming at you at one time, and it could be that we just missed something. So we do ask for you to make those comments and let you know that we read them very much intensely with an eye out for things that we missed. So we did publish them on November 1st, 2019, and if you're familiar with the master calendar outlined in the Higher Education Act, you'll know that that is the very last day we can publish in order to make the regulations effective on July 1 the following year. Now, some people think the master calendar is a bad idea. I happen to think it's a good one. Prior to my time at the department, I spent many years working at schools. So I was you. I know what it feels like to think there's always something new coming at me and I have to plan for it, and I'm not sure how I'm going to implement it yet, or how my servicer or how my software vendor is going to do certain things. These regulations are less about that. This NPRM, these final regulations, they did not have as many things for financial aid administrators or even institutions to have to do or change. So that's a good thing for you, but it's still important that you know what we did and why. So these regulations are effective next July, on July 1st, 2020. And then there are a few provisions where we needed a little additional time to implement them, just in terms of phasing out the old and starting up the new. There are some timelines that just didn't work well because we didn't want to ask institutions or accrediting agencies to have to submit things on a new timeline with some new information that they previously hadn't when their reviews were coming up very shortly after this implementation. So we have a few provisions that we've extended out and said that we would have those be effective on July 1st, 2021. So now going into that accreditation package that was just published in November, there are kind of 3 topics that I have on this slide that are in black font and 3 that are in gray font. The 3 that are in black font are the items we're going to discuss here. The other 3 items are items that will be discussed in the other presentations on the regulatory updates. So here we're going to talk on the accreditation items alone. First, I want to quickly talk about the purpose of the regulations, what we were going for. What we often hear at negotiated rulemaking is, what problem are you trying to solve? What are you trying to do here? And there are times that we know what we're trying to do, but we're still trying to figure out the right way to get there. And that's where, again, the conversations around the table are so important. One of the biggest things we wanted to do here was to kind of strengthen the triad and really clearly outline what everyone is supposed to do. We found that over the years, there is kind of the creep of everybody stepping on each other's toes just a little bit, in a friendly way, but still there's some duplication of efforts when that happens. And we found that we were doing things that really weren't in our lane or our space. One of the things that you may have heard if you attended the general session yesterday was that we are not in the business of regulating educational quality. Now, that doesn't mean nobody regulates educational quality. That means we, as the Department of Ed, at the post-secondary education level, are not about regulating your programs or your majors or your certificates. That is not our role. There are others in the triad that have that role, and so we should stay out of it and leave it to them. That's a simplification. That's really what we wanted to do here. So there are no bad motives, in my opinion. It's all about making sure that we're working effectively and efficiently with each other. So it's not to say that anybody was doing anything wrong. It's just that sometimes we were kind of piling it on And there was duplication that was hurting the institutions because the institutions were feeling that they needed to provide information to multiple sources. We also wanted to establish substantial compliance as the standard for when an agency would be recognized by the Secretary. So there's an approved list of accrediting agencies that are permitted to be what we call Title IV gatekeepers. A Title IV gatekeeper means if you have that accrediting agency, then you are eligible for Title IV aid, assuming you meet the other institutional eligibility requirements. But you must have an accrediting agency that is on that approved list. We wanted to make sure that we were recognizing some of the unique nature and characteristics of those accrediting agencies. We wanted to make sure that we weren't trying to use a one-size-fits-all kind of standard, which is previously what we really had done. So just as your institutions are quite varied and a small school is going to operate much differently than a large university, we wanted to make sure that accrediting agencies had some flexibility to be somewhat unique and hold to their missions. So we'll talk about that coming up as well. We also wanted to increase mobility for students, both from an academic standpoint and a career standpoint. So what we mean by that is, from an academic side first, we have students who are in programs, and then other institutions would evaluate credits that they had previously taken. And for example, some institutions would say, we are not going to recognize any credits from a nationally recognized accrediting agency. And so students would have the knowledge that they obtained from taking those classes, but the institution was saying, we won't consider them. We wanted to remind institutions that it was really important not to make students repeat coursework if they've already taken it and been successful. Now that said, we're not taking away the rights of institutions to choose from whom they will accept their credits. We're just asking them to review that. We're asking them to consider credits from any accredited institution. On the career side, we felt that there were times, and what we were hearing from employers especially, but also from other institutions, were that students were increasingly being told that they needed to get a higher level credential. So where an associate's degree previously might have been enough, now people are expecting a bachelor's degree. And probably more commonly, where a bachelor's degree was required previously as kind of the entry point into the career, now people are looking for that person to have a master's degree. So what we really wanted to do was to remind institutions and to remind accrediting agencies that it's important to kind of revisit that curriculum that you have in place and see if there's a way to modernize the curriculum and think about the idea of, when we add things, is there anything we could take back out? I previously had worked at nursing schools, and the nursing school where I attended, or where I worked, they used to say, you know, we have these new innovations in healthcare, and so we have to add that to the curriculum. And the faculty senate would meet and they would discuss it, and that was a great thing. We want the students to be up to date with all of the latest and the greatest information so that they can go out and be good practitioners. However, what we used to say was, do we ever take anything out? Are we always adding? Is there anything that isn't needed anymore? And sometimes there were some outdated methods that were no longer used in hospitals or in healthcare settings that we said, you know, maybe we don't need to do that instruction anymore. Maybe we can take those 4 hours out and add 4 hours of other content in so that it's not always kind of piling on. Now that said, if you need something new and there isn't anything to take away, we don't expect you to do that. We're not looking to say, keep everything the same. We're just saying, take a look at it. See what makes sense for you. See what makes sense for your students. And we ask the accrediting agencies to do the same. But again, reminding them that it is not a one-size-fits-all kind of method. And we wanted to reduce regulatory burden. That has been kind of a theme of this administration. It's been really stressed upon us to look at what we do as well. We're asking you to take a look. We need to take a look as well. We need to take a look at what we're asking. We need to take a look at, again, modernizing and seeing if we're asking for something new, is there something old that's no longer relevant? Is today's market so different? Is today's atmosphere a different one? So we wanted to look at ourselves as well. And quite frankly, I'm really proud of that. I like doing that. I like continual improvement, and I know that many of you do as well. So again, talking about the idea of substantive changes. This is a way of reducing some of that regulatory burden and some of the procedural burden. We wanted flexibility for institutions. We also wanted them to be able to innovate more quickly than what they typically have been able to do. We wanted them to do that to, again, work with the students, give the students what they need and what maybe makes sense for your local area or for your region or your state, or even on a national level, what the students would need to be able to be successful in a given career or in a profession. So we wanted to respond not only to student needs, but to workforce needs. So that's when we talk about kind of the economics of this regulation. That was really important to us. We had an employer as one of our negotiators who was really good in talking about innovation and who talked about some of the ideas of why employers wanted to be more involved. And I think that it was really eye-opening for many of the people around the table, and we were really grateful for his advice. We still wanted to protect, though, the institutional mission and the autonomy that institutions have in deciding what their programs are, how their programs will operate. We wanted to have guardrails, is how I think of it. We wanted to make sure that things were operating within a certain set of parameters, but then allowing for innovation and allowing for differences within those structures. So we wanted to allow institutions to consider their values, determine how they would administer that, how they would be organized and how their structure would be, talking about things like shared governance and how would they make decisions about new programs and other things that affect their students. We also wanted to make sure that we were not changing things in a way that would have negative consequences or unintended consequences. So as we were looking at these kinds of things, we wanted to make sure when we looked at major changes or substantive changes that we were doing the oversight in a proper way. So we wanted to make sure we were looking at the highest risk changes that were out there or the more complex changes so that we were putting our time and effort into the things that mattered most. We were looking at things like mission changes or the mix of programs that you're offering. So if you had previously been a nursing school and you now want to teach music, that's a very big difference. And we would expect your accrediting agency to say, we need to examine that. We need to see that you're qualified to teach in a very different area. So I think that was really important for everyone to have a good dialogue about. The other one that we talked about at length was level of offering. So again, if you're going from a certificate program to a degree offering school, we wanted to make sure that the accrediting agencies were reviewing those kinds of decisions. Or if you'd previously offered an associate's degree and now you say, we want to do bachelor's and master's level programs, we wanted someone to be able to take a look at that. Not to necessarily look at every program offered, but to say, does this institution have what it takes to offer education at that level? Do they have the proper resources to give the students what they're paying for? Generally, I think the answer is yes. You've already done self-studies, you've written up documents for the accrediting agency when you're applying for those kinds of things. But we wanted to kind of target that activity. We wanted to make sure they were looking at the things that mattered and then looking less at the things that don't matter. We wanted to make sure we were clarifying the recognition process. So again, as an institution, this might be less relevant to you, but we do want you to know how it works for the agencies that are overseeing your work. Just as you go through institutional eligibility types of reviews, you are recertified anywhere from 18 months to a 6-year period, you go through institutional eligibility reviews. And an eligibility analyst looks at documents, they look at things on your website, they look at prior history of information that the department has on file. We do a similar thing at the department within our unit, looking at accrediting agencies and deciding should they still be on that list of recognized accrediting agencies to be Title IV gatekeepers, to essentially be stewards of Title IV funds. So we wanted to make sure that we were looking at accrediting agencies from a slightly fresh perspective. And we used to talk about having regional accrediting agencies and national accrediting agencies. And then there were also the more specialized accrediting agencies that were programmatic. In talking through why we wanted to do this negotiated rulemaking, one of the key points we kept coming back to in our discussions is that we wanted to eliminate artificial barriers. And we wanted to take away some of the connotations that people might have had when making distinguishing comments about the two types of accrediting agencies, because quite frankly, we didn't see a big difference. We hold them to the same standards, we have the same requirements for what makes you eligible to be an accrediting agency, and so we kind of wanted to take down that change and that looking at the differences. We wanted to look more at the commonalities. So when we looked at the idea of what makes someone a regional accrediting agency, years ago, I think that was more relevant. Years ago, you could kind of look at the country, and if you looked at a map, you'd divide it up into chunks, for lack of a better word, and you would say, yes, here's the Northeast, here's the Southwest, and each of those areas would have their own accrediting agency. Over time, there are people who said, I'd rather use that accrediting agency. There's something that is unique about them, and I'd rather go there. And so they became less regional, even though we still use that terminology. And some states had things in their laws, on the books, basically saying, if you want to sit for licensure for this exam after you've completed your academic program, you need to have attended a regionally accredited institution. We felt that was problematic. We wanted to make sure that if a student, and especially a student who used Title IV aid to receive their education, but all students really, we wanted to make sure if they went through the effort to complete an academic program, if they could pass that licensure exam, we kind of wondered what the difference was of which type of institution they attended, an institution that was accredited by a regional group or a national group. If they have the academic ability to pass the exam, we felt that was more important. So we thought that a lot of people would agree with that, and it turns out there was quite a bit of discussion, but we got to a point where we felt comfortable saying there are now really three types of accrediting agencies. There are institutional accrediting agencies, so taking kind of that former terminology of regional and national and combining it into one and saying these are places that they accredit institutions. That is one group. Then we have the programmatic, and they do things that are special types of disciplines. So there might be one for X-ray technicians. There's a group that accredits those types of institutions. But then there are other institutions that are kind of a hybrid, and they also do accrediting for institutions, but also have a special focus as well. So they are considered specialized accrediting agencies. So we do still have three types. We make no distinguishing remarks anymore about regional versus national. They're institutional. And so when we list them on our website for who is eligible to be a Title IV gatekeeper and what agencies are actually accredited, we list them now as institutional. We wanted to encourage and enable innovation. What we were hearing is that college presidents would come and talk to us and say, we find that it's a struggle to get through your regulations as well as our institutional process. How can we make this better? Well, one of the ways we can make this better is to encourage the agencies to speed up the process. Now again, we don't want to have them not reviewing what they need to review. We don't want them to just quickly check a couple of boxes and say, sure, go ahead. We want the oversight to be there. We want to make sure that the students are still protected. That is still why we are here, is to assist the students in obtaining funding to obtain their education. So with them in mind first, we looked at the idea of the agencies and we said, but how can you still have the oversight that you need and speed up the process? We're not trying to step on toes. We're not trying to tell you how to do your work, accrediting agencies, but what can we do to assist you? So we looked again at what we were asking for. We made sure we weren't duplicating efforts. We made sure that we were asking them to do the role that belonged to them and us to do the role that belonged to us. But we also had some requirements outlined more as procedural than regulatory in some cases, but in some cases both. So we said, let's take a look at what we are doing to recognize the agency. Are there areas that we could do differently? So we're now asking them in some cases for less information once they've already established that they can perform a certain function. So not to step on the toes of the other presenters who are going to cover this in more detail, but one example of that is if you want to start a competency-based education program at your institution, the accrediting agency would be reviewing that. They would decide if you have the resources in place to do that. But once you have one in place, from our perspective, we don't need to see that again. We know that you have that in place. The accrediting agencies need to decide for themselves, do they need to look at it again? Do they need to look at things like an additional location? Again, if you already have one, do they need to look at it when you go to a second one? And maybe they decide for their standards they want the answer to be yes. Maybe they will look at the second one. Maybe they'll look at the third, fourth, and fifth, but they say after you have 5 and they're doing well and we've reviewed them, we say you can have additional ones without seeking our permission, you just need to notify us. So it's kind of like what you do with institutional eligibility with the department when you're adding locations. So we are looking at a lot of different ways that we can make the burden less on you and make sure the processes are more streamlined. We know that accrediting agencies sometimes only meet 4 times a year. So what people were telling us was their agenda's full for the next time. They'll hear our issue in 6 months. We want to add a program, but they can't even look at it for 6 months. When they look at it, they might want more information from us. So it could take a year to add a new program. There's a need in our community right now. What can we do to make that better? So I think we've put some things in place that actually can make that better. Again, much of it is at the option of the accrediting agency. They will decide for themselves what their standards will be. We tell them kind of the minimum, and they can certainly exceed that, and we know that many of them will. We also wanted to make sure that we were being supportive of agencies when they were taking an adverse action against an institution. Generally, by the time they get to that point, they have a lot of information that led them to take that action. They often have given the institution an opportunity to already send additional information. They've considered that information. This is generally kind of closer to an end point, not a starting point. So if an institution has an adverse action that the agency wants to take, rather than us being silent and not supporting them, we wanted to make sure we were supporting the accrediting agency and kind of backing them up with any information that we had that might be relevant, or that we weren't just silent and said, well, you take your action and we're staying over here. We want to make sure that as members of the triad, we're sharing information, and that if we can be helpful to each other, we expect all 3 of the partners, including us, to be helping each other and to work together. Again, maybe that means then there isn't an adverse action. Maybe somebody has some information and says there's some special circumstances here that we need to address. And so that's important too. We want to share in both directions. Again, keeping quickly to the purpose of the regulations, there are some other areas where we wanted standards to be updated and we wanted to make sure we were modernizing. That again remains important. Innovation is still important. The one here I will highlight, though, is the idea of providing for experimentation. The word experimentation in education makes a lot of people nervous, and we understand that. We don't want the students to feel that they're not getting something that has already been tried and tested. However, we also know that somebody needs to be first. We want to provide for experimentation, but we don't want to allow it for everyone, and here's why. If you are struggling to administer the programs that you have now, we do not think it's a good idea to allow you to continue to add things that are what we would think of as outside of the box. We'd rather you stay in the box and get things in order, and then maybe later try some experimentation. But the idea that institutions that are doing things well and have a proven track record and have good ongoing reviews from their state and accrediting agencies when applicable, we want them to be able to try some new things and maybe pilot some things at their institution regarding new programs or a new format for their program. So we wanted to put that out there as something that was a really important goal of these regulations as well. One other item that I'll mention before we move on here is that we wanted to clarify that faculty-led decision-making models are not the only acceptable way to get new programs and new curriculum approved. That's not to say that everybody shouldn't use it. Some people may decide to, but we want there to be other flexibilities for institutions who operate differently. Some institutions say they would rather, in addition to having faculty, have others on their board to help make these kinds of decisions. And what we're thinking there is predominantly employers. We think this will happen more at certificate level programs. We think that it's a good option for some institutions. We are never requiring it. It's, again, one of the areas where we're saying there is some flexibility if you wish to do something a little differently at your campus. I already mentioned that we eliminated the distinctions between agencies, and so we've listed them out here again for you. And now on to more of the meat of the regulations. And I say that as a vegetarian, so I probably should think of a better analogy. Major policies that we changed here. We first, again, wanted to clarify some areas around mission. That, again, rather than geographic location, we want to look at how the accrediting agencies are reviewing institutions and how they look at their programs. We do think it's really important that the accrediting agencies are looking at programs. It doesn't necessarily have to be every program all the time, but that we have some method for knowing if a program is working and if it's providing quality instruction for those students. We already talked about eliminating geography in the scope and the recognition of agencies. I do want to remind you, though, that part of these regulations we're also looking at faith-based institutions and faith-based issues. So this last bullet on the slide is really, it's partially about that as well. It's reminding agencies that they need to respect the mission of institutions, especially when they're relying on religious tenets, beliefs, and teachings. So we certainly are not saying that an agency would overlook something that affected educational quality, but we're saying that maybe an agency would look at an institution and allow that institution to have alternatives when something might conflict with their religious values. So one example would be if you had a religious institution that said they were against abortion. And if you have a medical school at that institution, in order to be a doctor, many people would say you need to know how this works. You need to know how that procedure is done. And many programs would allow a student to be part of that process. If you are a religiously based institution, though, that believes that it is wrong, you might not want to have that on your hospital or at your campus. So there might be an alternative way you can achieve that goal. Maybe there is an institution across town or a hospital down the street that would perform that task, and you would have your students go there to receive that instruction. There are other things, there are other examples, that's just one, but we clearly wanted to remind institutions and remind accrediting agencies that there are times that that institutional mission may yield a requirement for an alternative to what the typical standard is. So once again, this goes back to one size does not fit all. We wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, make sure that transfer credits were something that were considered on the basis of the information exchanged and taught in those classes, as opposed to the type of institution that gave the education. Again, we are not saying that everybody needs to take credits from every other institution. You still should be reviewing the quality of that. You may ask for a syllabus so that you can review what is taught in that class. You may ask for other outlines or curriculum plans, things like that from other institutions when you're deciding and evaluating credits for a transfer student. You should still continue with that. You want to do that. We're just saying don't have a blanket policy that says I won't take credits from any institution that's accredited by what we formerly would have called a national agency. The goal here is, first of all, to recognize what students have learned, but again, to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. We want to make sure that if a student has already put the effort in to take a class, pass a class successfully, and paid for it, we want to make sure that we're not asking them to then repeat those courses, and that the taxpayer doesn't have to help pay for them to do that again. As I mentioned earlier, based on mission and how the institution functions, we wanted to allow the accrediting agencies to monitor institutions differently. We wanted to make sure that we were allowing for different methods of instruction, different types of instruction, and that those delivery systems wouldn't be thought of necessarily as much as the outcomes would be thought of. So we really do want things to be outcomes based. How is the student able to function when they complete this coursework if it's for a career-focused type of education? Typically, again, those are certificate or diploma programs, but that might be associate degrees as well, or in some cases even maybe a bachelor's or a master's degree. So again, we're looking at all institutions and we're looking at all accrediting agencies and asking them to just consider what the way they want to function is and how they might expand what they're doing now for a more customized experience for you. One of the things that is not on the slide that I would also mention is we wanted to keep in mind the idea of potential expansion in the accreditation area. Not so much expansion from one agency, but it could be, but we wanted to allow for other accrediting agencies to form and to be available to you. So what we were thinking is there might be somebody who would come in and have a more specific focus than the typical agencies out there now that serve you or that are available to you. So maybe a specific religious group would say, we would like to be the accrediting agencies for institutions that are within our religious discipline. That would be one example. Another example I would give is tribal colleges and universities may say, we have very unique needs for our students at our institution, and we would like an agency to form that would serve our institutions wherever they exist in the country. That might be another area of a specialty kind of accrediting agency. And we felt that the regulations we had in place made it hard for new agencies to form, and that this would be really helpful in just reminding institutions that they may want to think about who best suits their needs, who is better able to evaluate the quality of education for the program mix that you have. So again, looking at education, looking at what you can do differently as options and not requirements, looking at the idea of piloting some things and experimenting within some controls, and again, with proper oversight, very key so that we're protecting students. We also, as I mentioned earlier, wanted to make sure that employers had some role when possible, especially as you're forming new programs, especially career-focused programs. We wanted to provide opportunities for the agencies to increase accountability. And again, to make sure that we were streamlining that so that each member of the triad was doing their role and not the role of the others. We also wanted to make sure that agencies had an opportunity to take action earlier. And again, by action, we're not talking about saying, okay, we cut off your accreditation. We were thinking about other actions that might make it easier to, again, protect the integrity of the programs being offered. And so one of the examples that we have here is the idea of teach-out plans. Many institutions will talk about the idea of teach-out plans and say, my accrediting agency requires them. We first want to focus on the difference between a teach-out plan and a teach-out contract. So the idea of a plan is what you do when you're thinking about the future. The contract itself is when you say, okay, we have a teach-out that needs to be done, and so we have a teach-out in place. That's a contract. This is not a contract. This is saying, what would we do if we closed? We know that some institutions are doing these already. Some accrediting agencies want everyone to have a plan in place. Other agencies are saying, no, only in signs of distress will we ask for that. We are saying here that we just want to remind agencies they have the flexibility to ask for a teach-out plan. We want to make sure that plan is something they put in place with great thought and care, and so that if they did have to close, that their students would have opportunities to complete their academic program, which is in fact the goal of them starting the program, is to allow them to get to completion. We want them to be good taxpayers, we want them to be a good steward of the funds that they receive at the institutional level, but that students also remember the goal is to complete your program and go out and then get a job and contribute to the country, to pay your taxes, to be a good employee. So these are all good goals to have, but again, we want to permit the idea of that contract or the teach-out agreement before a school announces that it's closing. So maybe you have that teach out plan and you say, this is what we would do if we were going to close. We then want to make sure that the institution isn't waiting until it's closing to say, all right, we're closing today, here's our new agreement. We've signed this with the school down the street for which we already had a plan. The idea here is to say that accrediting agencies have the right to ask for that agreement, again, contract, before the school says it's actually closing, but possibly in times of distress. So again, we heard some criticisms about these regulations that we were trying to take down oversight. The goal here is increased oversight, but in a responsible way. We also wanted to reduce the idea of credential inflation. I mentioned earlier the idea of things that used to be a bachelor's now require a master's degree. That might be the way you need to do it. We're not saying that's wrong, but we're saying consider it. Consider whether that's necessary. Is it still something that you could add on to the program that you have? Is it something that you could expand part of your curriculum? Or do they need the additional degree? Have things changed so much in that discipline that you need more education than you needed previously? Those are all okay answers. We're not trying to tell you what to do. We're not trying to tell the agencies, both the accrediting agency or the state, what to do. We're trying to remind them of what we feel is their responsibility and what we feel is our responsibility in that triad. We especially wanted to make sure we were looking, though, at that point, at programs that lead to state licensure. We wanted to make sure that we were allowing all students to have the same opportunities. When you continue to add on courses, that continues to add to the cost of attending that institution. So we wanted to make sure that there weren't artificial barriers that were keeping lower income students out of certain areas or certain programs of study. We also wanted to make sure that attending an institution and getting the cost of that education and qualifying for employment in a field didn't exceed the cost of likely earnings. Now that's difficult to monitor for, and it's difficult to know in some areas, but we just want to make people mindful of the idea. We want to make sure that going to school for some lower paying area is not going to cost them so much that they never really see a return on their investment. So it's important to keep in mind what students will earn later. It's also important for them to keep it in mind when they're borrowing money to attend school. Are they going to be able to pay it back? Generally, we say that the amount of debt doesn't correlate with default, but we do know that in certain areas, it is very difficult to repay your loans when you're making such a low starting salary. We want students to be better informed, we want them to be educated consumers, and we want them to think about what it would cost to attend school and what they reasonably might likely earn when they finish. The session just prior to this one, a couple rows down, was on the college scorecard. That's an effort we're doing to try to inform the consumer or the student about these kinds of costs and what they might likely receive in earnings when they first come out of school. And again, one of the things that we focused on, again, was the agency itself and what process they have to go through to be approved. We wanted to make sure that we were streamlining the process and that we were reducing regulatory burden. Whether it be an initial application for a new agency or a renewal of one that is already a Title IV gatekeeper, we wanted to make sure we were asking for the right things. What we often do is have a checklist, and we have paper that we ask for, and we look for information in files, or we interview members of the institution, employees, students, that kind of thing, members of the community. We get information, and then we determine, do they comply with this requirement? Do they comply with that requirement? And it tended to be pretty much a 100%. Did they comply? Didn't they comply? Well, as you all know, nobody's perfect. We were expecting perfection, though. We were expecting you to have 100% completion of something and a 0% error rate. We also know that that's not realistic. We can't expect that all the time. So we had to really look at what we were asking for and look at some distinctions. And instead of seeing things as black and white, looking at them in the shades of gray that they are. So one example of that is we require accrediting agencies to have a conflict of interest policy. We ask them to have that information on file and available when the analyst comes or requests information in writing to show that all of their board members have met that policy and have acknowledged it in some way. So there's generally a piece of paper in a file, or maybe something scanned, but in a file that shows that each board member has complied and has signed that. So let's say, for example, you have 10 board members. And let's say, for example, you have 9 pieces of paper in your file or 9 electronic files with these conflict of interest policies agreed to and acknowledged. You have one where you say to yourself, I know I did that. I know we had every one and now I can't find one. Maybe you scanned it improperly and one page didn't get scanned. Maybe you lost a piece of paper and it's in another file. Those things happen. So we wanted to acknowledge that and say we were looking for substantial compliance. We're not going to kind of put a finding out there for every little item that you don't have perfectly. We want to be more flexible. These are standards that we established. They're not necessarily items that we think are so critical. So we're not talking about major information here. We're talking about more the minors, the smaller items. For example, we would want board of directors to submit resumes, and we would expect the institution to keep them on file. Again, are you missing one from your file? Is it something that you could obtain and kind of cure the finding later? So we're not saying it's not important, and we're not saying we don't care about it, but is it something you can fix or repair so that we can say, okay, it's good now. We know that you're making the effort to comply. And so I think we wanted to make sure that we were limiting those situations to things that would not hurt the integrity of the process. We're not saying, oh, let's just kind of let it all go. We're not saying that everything can have small errors. When it's a pattern and a practice that you're not being careful, well, then we want to look at that. We want the agencies to look at that. So again, these are more for minor occurrences that we felt, especially if they could be something you could cure or something that was not hurting the integrity of the process. I said I would leave about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and I see that we have about 16 minutes left. Microphones 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the aisles for you if you have questions. I will be happy to try to answer them. If I cannot answer them, I will get you an answer and we can exchange emails or contact information. Microphone number 2.
Hi, you had stated in the transfer of credit policy you couldn't specify we won't accept credit from previously recognized national bodies. Can the policies state the accrediting agencies that they do accept credit for?
You can state that in your policy, but again, we would expect that you would be looking at others as well, that you're not just making a blanket statement that you're not accepting them from somewhere. You can say that we automatically know we have taken credit in the past from these accrediting agencies or from institutions accredited by these agencies. What we're really trying to get away from here is the blanket, we won't consider this at all. So we want you to be looking at, and that's accrediting agency-wide. It may be that you've already reviewed a curriculum from a certain institution and you know that those are not credits you'll accept. We want you to be upfront about that with students. If they're looking to transfer into your institution, we would like them to know as early as possible, my credits may transfer or my credits absolutely won't. But we just want to make sure you're evaluating it so that you're being fair to the students.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Microphone number 3.
Hello, I was just wondering when the updates will take effect, specifically for substantial compliance and modified substantive change requirements.
So those would take place in 2020, so July 1st of next year.
Okay, thank you.
What we're delaying implementation of, just so you're clear, is typically things that are required for timeframes in terms of evaluating the accrediting agencies. We require a lot of information a year in advance from the agencies to submit to us, and then we review those documents over time and exchange questions and answers. We're moving that out to a longer time frame. So we couldn't necessarily say to institutions that are up for it in the next year, you have to have this for 18 months out if we previously asked for 12. So we're just giving kind of a ramp up to allow everybody to catch up with the new requirements. Also, microphone number 3.
Thanks. I have a question about how this policy is going to deal with bad actors in this space or prevent a situation like the ASIC situation that happened recently where an accreditor was not taking action on institutions that did have red flags raised or were under investigation.
So I think that's a really great question. We want to make sure that we are reviewing what we need to review and that accrediting agencies are reviewing their part, and again, state authorizing agencies doing their part. We hope that by publishing these regulations, we are sending out the message to those other two triad partners that we mean business and that we want to do business, that we want to work with them, that again, it is a partnering, so to speak, that we are not putting them out there on an island. And I think that the reason that some agencies hesitated to take action against institutions is that they were concerned that we would try to somehow overturn that decision or that we would not support them in the decision that they were making. And then the same holds true with the accrediting agencies. There was concern that if they shared certain things they were doing with the department, that we would take action against them. They were concerned if they didn't have kind of a perfect score, that we would take action against them. We want to let them know that, again, we're looking for substantial compliance, but we're also changing the way that we're reviewing the accrediting agencies. So we've changed our standards. We're looking at how we evaluate them to say, are they helping to make sure that quality is first and foremost for the students who are attending the programs that they accredit? So I think the part about us looking at our processes and making sure that we're looking at the right things as opposed to the redundancy and kind of what for some people felt like busy work, we are trying to kind of tighten up what we do and how we do it. And I think that will help with the concerns of not taking action when needed. Microphone number 2.
Hello. With the national and regional accrediting agency distinction being removed, will the institution be required to remove this language from their catalogs and promotional materials by July 1st, 2020?
Awesome question, and the answer is happily no. If you want to refer to them in that way, or if the agencies want to still use that terminology, we would not stop them. We really can't regulate that. So what we're regulating here is how we will refer to them. So we won't use those distinctions anymore. We hope that that will catch on and that others will do that as well, but we don't require you to remove it. Now that said, there are some states that have requirements for licensure that previously said they required regional accreditation or certain benefits from other agencies that said that the student had to be attending a regionally accredited institution. Some of those agencies and some of those states have already told us that they're changing their laws or putting a rider to their laws or doing something to change policy or procedure so that that's no longer the case, so that their students can then go to any institution and there's no restriction on the type of agency that would need to accredit them.
As a follow-up question, department though will remove from their website, like where you list all the agencies, any distinction between
Yes, the department will be updating the website, and I believe that's already begun, so that we are no longer referring to those agencies as national or regional. We will call those agencies institutional. We still have a few minutes left if anyone has additional questions. Again, please don't feel obligated if you have a question that you don't want to ask in front of others. I am happy to take those privately if that's better for you. And if, again, you think of a question later and you'd like to send me an email message, I or a member of the staff will certainly respond to you and get back to you as soon as possible. Yes, one last question perhaps.
If an institution is facing an adverse action from an accrediting body and it's challenging that action, as I understand it under these regulations, it could also begin the process of seeking accreditation by another accrediting body, and they would have to notify the department of that. And depending on what the reasons were for their challenge to the adverse action by the first accreditor, the department would allow them to proceed with that second accreditation process?
So the department may allow that. It is something that is possible under these regulations, but it is a may, not a must. So we would look at the reasons that they were looking for another accrediting agency. The problem now is that some institutions felt that they couldn't change agencies ever. We will allow them now to make updates, to make changes. If they see an accrediting agency that they think meets their needs better or has standards that meet their situation better, we would allow them to go to another agency. We do want them to notify us so we're aware of the transition and we can review the reasons for that transition. We do allow it under adverse action situations, but we want to keep a close eye on it.
Okay, so your primary position, though, is that an institution can only have one institutional accreditor.
We would say that they are expected to have one institutional accreditor. We would not expect them to have two.
All right, unless they can demonstrate a case that the second institutional accreditor they want to apply to brings some specialization.
We would look at that reason, and we would expect that there could be, in theory, some overlap if they're already accredited by an institutional accrediting agency and it doesn't expire until a certain date, but they end up getting approved under the second one earlier. There could be some overlap, but generally we would expect them to have one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let me just make sure we're off mic. Since there are no more questions, I just want to thank everybody for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference, and when you're leaving, safe travels back home.